Hi guys, we're going to talk about chapter 19, and this is going to review organizational, interpersonal, and group communication. Communication is key to a nurse manager position, and we're in leadership class, so we're really going to focus in on that management spot, that upper leadership spot. Communication can be done with patients, with colleagues, with superiors, and subordinates. We know that nurse practice tends to be group oriented. So interpersonal communication among group members is necessary for continuity and productivity. Organizational communication is more complex because of more communication channels, more individuals to communicate with, more information to transmit, and new technologies that can complicate as well as ease the delivery. In this chapter, we're going to look at different forms of communication. We're going to look at barriers, channels, and modes, how to communicate assertively, nonverbal, and how to continue to use active listening as the means of interpersonal communication. So let's get started here. When we define communication, we say it is the exchange of thoughts, messages, or information by speech, signals, writing, or behavior. Communication can occur verbally or non-verbally. Communication impacts all management activities and cuts across all phases of the management process. The ability to communicate effectively often determines the success as a leader manager. Communication begins the moment that two or more people have become aware of each other. Common elements to the communication process include internal and external climate for both the sender and the receiver. The message can be delivered written, nonverbal, or verbal. So you can see that process there, right? There's the sender. We pull in internal and external climates. There's the receiver. Again, they're pulling in internal and external climates. And then that message between, again, can be written, nonverbal, and verbal. So let's look at internal and external climate communication. We can define internal communication that includes the values, feelings, temperament, and stress levels of the sender and of the receiver. Remember, they both have that internal climate. The external climate includes status, power, and authority as barriers to manager-subordinate communication. Both the sender and receiver need to be very sensitive to the internal and external climates because the perception of the message could be altered depending on the climate that exists when the message was sent or received. Effective communication requires the sender to validate what receivers see and hear, right? Our perception of the message is always huge. So making sure if you are the sender, what did the receiver get from whatever you communicated? Variables that affect organizational communication include the number of levels that we have to communicate with, the gender, and power and status. People at lower levels of the organization hierarchy are at risk for inadequate communication from higher levels. Right, you can see the little chart there. If they're communicating up at the top and then we're splitting it into two groups and then we're splitting it down further, right, those lower hierarchy maybe have a disconnect between that communication. Gender definitely plays a factor. Men and women communicate and use very different languages. Men and women communicate differently and use very different languages. When workers feel unimportant or ignored, then job satisfaction and teamwork declines, and it becomes difficult for our leaders to address those problems that are affecting the ability of the organization to function and change. Open communication cannot be underestimated by the manager. Although organizational communication is complex, the following strategies increase clear and complete communication. Leader managers understand the organization's structure and recognize who is affected by decisions. Formal and informal communications both need to be considered. Formal communication follows the formal line of authority in an organization's hierarchy. Informal communication occurs among people at the same or different levels of the organizational hierarchy. Communication is not a one-way channel. It must be clear, simple, and precise. Senders should seek feedback whether communication is received. And one way to do this is to ask that receiver to repeat that communication back. Multiple communication methods should be used. If we provide a variety of communication modes, it increases the likelihood that people are going to hear that message. An unnecessary message or unnecessary information should not be disclosed. Communication channels used by the manager may be upward, downward, horizontal, diagonal, or through the grapevine. In upward communication, needs and wants are communicated upward to the next level in the organization. Downward communication flows from the top to the bottom. Horizontal communication are individuals that interact with others on the same hierarchy. Diagonal communication is the interaction with individuals from other departments and groups who are not on the same level as the organizational hierarchy. And then grapevine communication flows quickly, haphazardly among people of all hierarchies. This communication is subject to error and distortion because of the speed at which it passes, and because the sender has little formal accountability for that message. And you guys have probably played like the telephone game, right? It's just kind of through that grapevine. So the most informal communication network is often called grapevine. Grapevine communication flows quickly and haphazardly among people of all hierarchies. We just said this on that last slide. It usually involves 3 or 4 people at a time. Senders have little accountability for that message, and often the message becomes very distorted as the speed goes. So just to recap here, the clarity of a message is significantly affected by the mode of communication. In general, the more direct the communication, the greater the probability of clear communication. The more people involved in filtering the communication, the greater the chance of distortion. So let's talk a little bit about modes of communication. Typical modes of communication are written, face-to-face, telephone, and nonverbal. Written messages allow for documentation, can be open to various interpretations, and it's mostly used by managers. In our nursing world, right, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So getting documentation of conversations is pretty vital, really, in our whole healthcare network. Face-to-face or oral communication is rapid, but may only reach a few people. Managers communicate verbally, remember, upward, downward, formally, and informally. Telephone communication is also very rapid, and it allows the receiver to clarify the message at the time of delivery. Nonverbal can not be obtained by the sender or the receiver with this mode of communication. Nonverbal communication includes those facial expressions, body movements, and gestures. This form of communication is considered more reliable than our verbal communication because it conveys that emotion. Effective leaders are congruent in their verbal and nonverbal communication so that followers are clear about the messages they receive. So elements of nonverbal communication. We know that nonverbal communication makes up about 50 to 70% of all communication. So we've talked quite a bit about these in previous courses, but remember silence, it's that weird awkward time, making sure that we're not staying silent for too long. Space or proxemics, that's the degree of space we require depending on who we're talking to, as well as the situation that we are in. Some cultures are going to require greater space. So if you can remember back in our mental health, we talked about 6 to 18 inches of space is that intimate relationship. 18 inches to 4 feet is just those personal interactions. 4 to 12 feet is common for those social exchanges. If it's greater than 12 feet, then that's just a public distance, and that could imply lack of trust or warmth, where inadequate space may make people feel threatened or intimidated. When we think about the environment, that is where the communication is taking place. The appearance can be non-verbally communicated through what is the clothing that we're wearing, how is our hairstyle, do we use cosmetic, are we attractive? So appearance can definitely be a non-verbal communication. Eye contact invites interaction and emotional connection. The presence or absence of eye contact is strongly influenced by cultural standards or religious practice. Posture can also influence your nonverbal communication. If you're sitting up straight, right, that indicates that the person is very focused, they're paying attention. If you're really slouching, it's going to really make it seem like you're bored or indifferent to whatever is being talked about. Gestures can take on added emphasis. Too much can be very distracting. Facial expression and timing must agree with the message. Managers with a pleasant and open expression are perceived as approachable, but on the other hand, hesitation often diminishes the effect your statement or implies untruthfulness. So even if you have a nice expression on your face and you're very open, right, the nurse is going to approach you, but if that diminishes based off whatever your conversation is about, then it's going to maybe cause some untruthfulness thoughts to that receiver. And vocal expressions such as tone, volume, and inflection add to the message. The goal should always be to convey confidence and clarity. So types of verbal communication. Verbal skills are an integral and critical part of leader managers. The inability to communicate needs or challenge other people's ideas can cause a lot of tension. It can lead to stress, anxiety, and even depression. Some of the types of verbal communication include passive aggressive, and assertive. So let's look at each of these, and then we're going to look at some of the misconceptions. Passive communication occurs when a person suffers in silence. Even when the person feels strongly about an issue, they will avoid the conflict, often at the risk of bottling up feelings, which could maybe later lead to an outburst. Aggressive communication is generally very direct. It can be threatening and condescending. It can infringe on another person's rights, and it intrudes into that person's personal space. Passive-aggressive communication is that aggressive message that's presented in a very passive way. I'm sure we all have used some passive-aggressiveness in our lifetime. Assertive communication is a way to communicate that allows people to express themselves in a direct, honest, and appropriate way that does not infringe on others' rights. So make sure you understand the difference in aggressive communication and assertive communication. Aggressive, again, is impending or infringing on another person's right, where assertive is being direct and honest, but we're not infringing on the rights of anybody else. So what are some misconceptions and myths about assertiveness? Assertive communication is a way to communicate that allows people, again, to express themselves in a direct, honest, and appropriate way, but it does not infringe on others' rights. So when we look at these myths, all behavior is either assertive or passive. And we know that's not true because we just talked about several different types of communication on that previous slide. To get what you want, all you have to do is be assertive, right? Those that are assertive don't always get what they want. It really involves both rights and responsibilities when you're being assertive. To be assertive is to be aggressive, and that, again, assertive communication is not rude or insensitive. Rather, it's having an informed voice that insists on being heard. Assertiveness is unfeminine. Assertiveness communication is rude or insensitive. And again, this is not a rude communication. It's having that informed voice that we want to be heard. So when you feel like you're under attack by an aggressive person, an assertive person can do several things. They can reflect the speaker's message back to them. This will help the aggressor evaluate whether the intensity of their feeling is appropriate to the situation. Again, we can repeat that assertive message. Repeating the message is going to focus on the message objective content, and this will be more effective when the aggressor overgeneralizes or seems to fixate on a repetitive line of thinking. We want to point out the implicit assumption. This might involve listening closely and letting the aggressor know that you have heard them. Restate the message by using assertive language. By rephrasing the aggressor's language, this is going to diffuse the emotion. Paraphrasing helps the aggressor to focus more on the cognitive part of that message. And then we want to question. If the aggressor is using nonverbal cues to be aggressive, the assertive person can put this behavior in the form of a question to help the aggressor be aware of the unwarranted reaction. So we all know about SBAR. It's a communication tool, right? It's that standardized communication tool that's critical to patient care, and it reduces those patient errors. SBAR again stands for Situation, Background, Assessment, and Recommendation. Do we know who used the first SBAR? Well, it actually was the U.S. Navy. And then when do we use that SBAR? We use it during handoff. And what happens if we don't use the standardized communication tool during handoff? Adverse events can happen. Medical errors can happen. Some facilities have even implemented the ISBAR, which adds that introduction step, especially if the staff have not worked with the patient previously. All of that should be really familiar for you. So if we talk about the GRR, G-R-R-R-R, as a listening tool, most people here actually retain only a very small amount of the information given to them. So to become better listeners, leaders must become aware of their own experiences, values, attitudes, and biases, how they receive and perceive messages. They also have to overcome information overload that can be inherent in a middle management role. Good listeners are able to ask questions. Boynton suggested that using a listening model such as that GRRR is helpful with where there's disruptive behavior, a toxic environment, and maybe even power struggles that interfere with listening. So you can look and see what that GRR stands for. The G is greeting. This is where dialogue is established. It's respectful listening by giving each other time to think and transmit critical information without interruption. Review occurs when the speaker summarizes the information they have conveyed to make sure the message was understood correctly. Recommendation or request, and then reward. When the communication exchange ends, both parties have collaborated. So just know this tool, this listening tool, and what the different components are for it. So again, this is just a recap, right? Most people hear or retain only a small amount of the information given to them. So that's why it's been really important that we've talked to you about giving the most important information first, right? If you keep talking for 5 minutes, they've heard the first few words and then they've stopped listening to you, because it's just general. People just don't retain all of that information given. Written communication used by most managers comes in the way of a memo. You probably have seen these before. Business memos have a twofold purpose. They bring attention to problems, and they also solve problems. Components of that memo might include a header, right? To, from, date, and the subject. An opening, context, and task. So what is the purpose of the memo? A summary detailing the ideas or plans. That's going to be that big detail part of the memo. And then closing segment with any necessary attachments. What actions do you want from that reader? And again, this slide should be review for you, and it's just a good reminder for social networking principles. I'm not going to read all of those to you. Just remember ANA and NCSBN have those principles for social networking. Again, more review for HIPAA that was established in 1996. HIPAA called for strict protection and privacy of medical information. Confidentiality can be breached legally only when one provider must share information about a patient so that another provider can assume care, right? HIPAA should be very, very familiar for you. Rapidly flourishing communication technologies have great potential to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of organizational communication. They also, however, pose increased challenges to patient confidentiality. So being HIPAA compliant, making sure we're securing those medical information in some kind of cloud could pose a challenge for some of our patients' confidentiality. The electronic health record is a digital record of a patient's health history that may be made up of records from many locations and/or sources such as hospitals, providers, clinics, public health agencies. Included in this information are patient demographics, progress notes, problems, medications, vital signs, past medical history, immunizations, labs, and radiology reports. So your EHR has all of that information. So what are the stages of group communication? Group communication is different from that individual communication. In order for groups to accomplish work, they must go through a sequence of stages of communication that are going to include forming, storming, norming, and then performing. The forming stage is where introductions take place, interpersonal relationships are built, expectations are defined, and directions are given. We're forming those relationships and forming those expectations. The storming stage begins to feel comfortable enough with each other, right? We're beginning to know each other. We've built those relationships. We know our expectations. So now we're becoming more comfortable to compete or disagree. So if it's managed appropriately, it can lead to trust, positive competition, and effective bargaining. The next stage is norming. These are where rules are established and the work starts to take place. This stage may not take place if no one takes the time to agree in that storming phase. And then the final performing stage is when the work gets done. There are 11 tasks each group performs. These tasks include initiator. This is the contributor who proposes group goals or redefines the problem. We have our information seeker, our information giver, opinion seeker, elaborator, coordinator, orienter, evaluator, energizer, procedural technician, who's the one that usually facilitates the group action by arranging the environment, and then our recorder. So each group is going to assign these tasks. Group task roles contribute to the work to be done. Group building roles provide for care and maintenance of that group. Examples of group building and maintenance role include encourager, harmonizer, compromiser, gatekeeper, standard setter, group commentator, and follower. So the organization or that group really should have a mix of all of these members. Group members also carry out roles that serve their own needs. Managers need to manage these members' roles so that individuals do not disrupt the group productivity. The 8 individual roles are our aggressor, right? They're going to express disapproval of other values or feelings through jokes. They may have verbal attacks or envy. Our blocker is our negative Nancy role. Recognition seeker works to focus positive attention on themselves. Self-confessor, playboy, that's your cynicism. Nonchalant horse player. Dominator will attempt to control and manipulate the group. Help seeker, special interest pleader, those are all commonly assumed roles within our group. Managers must be well grounded in group dynamic and group roles because of the need to facilitate group communication and productivity within that organization. It is a responsibility of the leader manager to use communication in such a way that it builds team relationships for a mutual goal attainment. First, leaders must be effective communicators themselves and role model excellent communication skills in all settings. In addition, leaders are responsible to establish and uphold administrative structures to require and support effective teamwork and communication in their organizations. And finally, leaders must have the skill to effectively confront, manage conflicts that arise out of poor communication. And that concludes chapter 19. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email. Otherwise, make sure you're reviewing this for your exam. Thanks, guys.